Fred, thanks very much. It is great to be back, and Fred is correct, both about the Atlantic Council's key role with regard to Ukraine, but also the fact that it was about a year ago, almost exactly, that I was here to announce our disinformation legislation, which is now law, by the way. And already the State Department is putting in place the Global Engagement Center that it calls for. And I want to thank Fred personally and the Atlantic Council for their work with us. Senator Murphy and I are appreciative of the effort that went into that. It's not typical these days that there is anything much good getting done on a bipartisan basis in Washington. And more importantly, it's not typical that something would be announced and then enacted into law within such a short space of time. It was enacted into law late last year. So we thank you, Fred, for that work, and of course what you do every day to strengthen the relationship between the United States and our allies in Europe, the broader focus of the Atlantic Council. A lot has happened in that last year since I was here, and I think suffice it to say that we probably could have fit everybody in Washington, D.C. who was focused on the information war, particularly the threat from Russia, in this one room. And today this is a topic that, of course, is on the front pages of the newspapers and on the broadcast news constantly. So things have changed. Our legislation is now law, and that gives us a chance to be able to better organize the U.S. government response to that information war. No one understands the consequences of Russia's information war better, of course, than the people of Ukraine. And I've learned that firsthand during my visits to Ukraine. I've also learned that in our work we're doing with the Ukraine caucus in Washington here, also on the Foreign Relations Committee where I now sit. And I was not on the Foreign Relations Committee a year ago, and we've already had a couple of hearings that focus on this issue. I've also had the opportunity to meet, as Fred indicated, with our Ukrainian community in Ohio. We have a strong Ukrainian-American connection through Ohio, and they've helped to keep me informed of what's going on in Ukraine. This morning I've been asked to talk a little about that, what's happening in Ukraine, what my perspective is on Ukraine, and I'm happy to do that. I think although great challenges remain, we have made progress even in the last year and certainly in the last several years. I'm going to talk about ways I think the United States and its allies can help to encourage more progress. I would say that the good news is that 3 years after Russia annexed Crimea and 25 years since Ukraine regained its independence, I believe Ukraine has come closer to realizing what I would consider the more open and democratic future that so many Ukrainians fought for on the Maidan. And it has done so in the face of direct military aggression from Russia and its proxies in the eastern part of Ukraine, severe economic and social pressures, and persistent Russian information operations designed to subvert the authority of the Ukrainian government, undermine faith in Ukraine's institutions, demoralize the Ukrainian people, and persuade the West, frankly, that Ukraine is a failed state, not worth the effort to prop up. So progress has been made, and it has been made in the face of real challenges. When we talk about Ukraine's fight to defend itself and pursue the future the Ukrainian people called for in the Maidan, I think we're essentially talking about two, what I would consider distinct but probably related conflicts. The first is the external conflict, which we've talked about a lot here at the Atlantic Council, and that's the ongoing political, economic, military, and information aspects of Ukraine's fight to defend itself. That's ongoing. I met with Ambassador Chali, who's here with us this morning. I think we'll hear from in a moment on this very topic. A couple of weeks ago, we discussed some of the issues that are going on today in Ukraine in some detail, the daily human cost as the fighting in the east of Ukraine continues. By the way, despite the Minsk ceasefire agreements, Russia continues to arm, train, equip, organize, and lead separatist forces in eastern Ukraine, while thousands of Russian troops are currently stationed in the Crimea and along the border. Some have said it's a frozen conflict. I don't think, Ambassador Chali, you would agree that the conflict is frozen. Sadly, it's not frozen. I don't think it's ever been frozen. I don't think it will end until something happens to alter Russia's calculation about whether continuing to fuel this conflict is worth the price. In the United States Senate, at least, we've been able to build a pretty durable bipartisan consensus on support for Ukraine. Even in today's highly charged partisan atmosphere I mentioned earlier, we've been able to keep ourselves focused on trying to be helpful to Ukraine. These bipartisan efforts, fostered by the Senate Ukraine Caucus, which Senator Durbin and I started about 2 years ago, key members of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, Senate Armed Services Committee, and others continue to generate new initiatives. In fact, just last week, Senator Sherrod Brown and I introduced a bipartisan resolution commemorating the 3-year anniversary of the annexation of Crimea and reaffirming U.S. support for Ukraine in efforts to hold Russia accountable for its violations of Ukrainian sovereignty and territorial integrity. So there is a bipartisan consensus still on this issue, which we must hold. There's also a bipartisan agreement on the policy tools the U.S. should utilize as part of its comprehensive U.S. strategy to support Ukraine, deter future aggression against our allies and interests, and uphold the fundamental principles of the U.S.-led international system that Russia's actions ultimately threaten. These policies include continued enforcement of joint U.S.-EU sanctions. Yesterday we had the opportunity to hear from the ambassador from the EU and the Foreign Relations Committee. We talked about the fact that the 6-month extension of the sanctions is a positive thing, that the EU is incredibly important ally in this. We also have continued increased discussion of both lethal and non-lethal military assistance to Ukraine. I believe it's fair to say that there is a bipartisan majority in the United States Congress that supports not just non-lethal but also lethal assistance so Ukraine can better defend itself. During the confirmation process, Secretary Tillerson expressed his agreement with that approach, by the way, and that's something that you continue to hear the administration talk about. We need to move forward with that, in my view. In the Congress, we're talking about an enhanced U.S. military presence in the region, more robust and coordinated efforts to counter Russian propaganda and disinformation in Ukraine, and for that matter throughout Europe, including with the elections in France and Germany upcoming, and a unity of action between the U.S. and the EU on holding Russia accountable for its violations of the Minsk agreements, the Budapest Memorandum for that matter, and other international norms and agreements. So I think there is a general bipartisan agreement on the policy tools that the U.S. should be utilizing. The second conflict I want to mention in Ukraine is the internal struggle. So we talked about the external side. We'll hear much more about that today. There's also an internal struggle to fulfill the promise of the Maidan. And finally, break free of the corruption, lack of accountability, and mismanagement that has hamstrung previous Ukrainian efforts to chart an independent, democratic, and pro-Western path. This may ultimately be as hard to win as the external conflict, but it's crucial to Ukraine's long-term success. Both are. I believe that corruption and weak institutions fuel the spread of Russian influence more than virtually anything else, both in Ukraine and throughout the world. Thus, the political and economic reforms are not just key to achieving greater transparency and accountability in government, which is so important, they're also national security priorities. The Ukrainian government, with the help of Ukraine's vibrant civil society, has made tremendous strides in tackling 25 years of cronyism, waste, fraud, and abuse throughout the government. For example, the Ukrainian government's successful management of the temporary nationalization of Privat Bank, Ukraine's largest private bank, is an underappreciated success story in my view. A better known example is the joint U.S.-Ukrainian effort to reform the police and border guard service. The successful introduction of roughly 16,000 new patrol police across Ukraine, trained by Ukrainian and American instructors, is an example of that. By the way, this includes instructors from the Dayton, Ohio Police Department, and I'm very proud of them and the efforts that they have made. This has been a highly visible and powerful message of progress in building the new Ukraine. The U.S. and NATO Train and Equip program has helped produce real improvements in the tactical proficiency of Ukrainian forces, as evidenced by successful recent combat actions against Russian-led separatist forces, such as in the clashes in Avdiivka at the end of January. Despite these successes, Ukraine continues to face challenges implementing difficult structural reforms. Now, I want to highlight two key areas where I think continued engagement from Ukraine and sustained assistance by its Western partners, including here at the Atlantic Council, will be particularly important. The first is the defense institutional reforms necessary to sustain the gains Ukraine's military has made over the long term and complete its transformation into a modern, professional fighting force aligned with NATO standards and procedures. Under Senator McCain's leadership, I have helped draft U.S. security assistance for Ukraine as part of the national annual defense authorization bill for the past 2 years. And the importance of defense institution building reforms such as improved logistics and sustainment capabilities will continue to be a focus because it's so important. For the first time, last year's military assistance package conditioned half of U.S. military assistance on successful progress toward implementing key defense reforms, such as civilian control of the military. greater parliamentary oversight, and budget and procurement transparency and accountability. The other critical reform priority I wanted to mention is the need for tangible, visible, and high-impact results from Ukraine's judicial reforms and anti-corruption initiatives. Ukraine and the United States have partnered on a number of projects to help reform the prosecutor's general office and judicial system, and have helped implement promising new initiatives like the National Anti-Corruption Bureau and the Specialized Anti-Corruption Prosecutor's Office. I believe that successful prosecutions of corrupt high-level officials or former officials or businessmen will generate meaningful momentum for President Poroshenko's reform agenda and demonstrate Ukraine's commitment to real and lasting reforms. After the Obama administration's somewhat belated and reactive response to Russia's aggression in Ukraine and broader reluctance to assume America's traditional leadership role in confronting and deterring security challenges around the world, not just in Ukraine, I know that many of you are anxious or curious to see what new approach the Trump administration might take to Ukraine, Russia, and America's role in the world. I am curious also. Let me just take a brief moment to share a few quick thoughts on how we might look at the road ahead. In my view, the new administration represents an opportunity, and it's an opportunity for a kind of real reset, one that renews America's commitment to our European allies, including Ukraine, and rededicates American foreign policy to upholding the shared interests and values that underpin the U.S.-led international system, upon which our national security and economic prosperity absolutely depends. The President's got a really impressive national security team, in my view. This includes, of course, professionals like Secretary Mattis, Secretary Tillerson, Lieutenant General McMaster, Secretary Kelly, the UN Ambassador Nikki Haley, and even the Atlantic Council's very own, Fred. To have Governor John Huntsman as our next ambassador to Russia is a very good sign, in my view. I think these are the kind of people you would want to have developing and executing the national security strategy we need, particularly as it relates to Ukraine. Some of you may know this, but General McMaster literally led the Army's Lessons Learned project on Russia's new generation war doctrine and its application in Ukraine. So he's very familiar with the situation in Ukraine. In addressing a daunting array of security challenges around the world, one of America's enduring advantages over our adversaries is our alliances around the world. It truly is incredible. There is no nation in history that's ever been able to count on such a vast network of allies and partners around the world, willing to go to war alongside U.S. forces, voluntarily open their markets to U.S. trade and investment, actively solicit our input and involvement in working toward shared goals, and agree to uphold shared interests, norms, and values. This is a tremendous strength that we have. To be clear, all of our partner nations need to do their part in upholding the shared burden that we have. I do believe it's unacceptable that only 5 of our 28 NATO member states can be said to meet the required 2% GDP threshold for defense spending, as an example. Yet, at the end of the day, we've got to remember the pivotal role these nations play in helping us to confront an increasingly dangerous, complex, and insecure world, a task we would otherwise be left to do alone. We have to build our alliances. The values and interests we share are the glue that keeps this valuable network of friends and allies together. Thus, America is ultimately strongest when its allies are strong too. In my view, restoring American strength and leadership goes hand in hand with renewing America's longstanding commitment to its allies and willingness to assume a leadership role in addressing shared challenges. To conclude, despite the uncertainties and risks of today's increasingly complicated strategic landscape, I remain fundamentally optimistic about Ukraine's prospects and the durability of the U.S. support for Ukraine in Congress. The United States and its allies must redouble their political, economic, and military support for Ukraine as part of a broader U.S.-led regional engagement strategy. Ukraine should also continue to make progress on implementing its ambitious reform agenda, as I noted today. And its friends in the West should help empower Ukrainian reformers by using its assistance to incentivize the fulfillment of some of these key reform objectives we talked about. I appreciate the opportunity to come and talk again about Ukraine today. And again, Fred, thank you for your continued personal engagement and support, and the Atlantic Council's tremendous support for our disinformation legislation and our ongoing efforts to help Ukraine. Fred mentioned that we have among us a number of distinguished guests. One I now have the privilege of introducing, one of the best known of the Ukrainian reformers, someone who shares transatlantic values, someone who has served both the government of the United States and the Ukrainian government, former Ukrainian Finance Minister Natalie Uresco. Having met with her during her tenure as finance minister, I can attest to the valuable role she played in guiding policies and developing trust between President Poroshenko's new government and senior U.S. officials and members of Congress. By the way, she was always very frank in her discussions, which I always appreciate. She was important in developing that trust between senior U.S. officials and members of Congress both, many of whom were excited about the changes happening in Ukraine but weren't quite sure what to make of the post-Maidan Ukraine or its new government. I'm really pleased she's joining us today and look forward to hearing her perspective. Thanks again for inviting me to speak today, Fred, and we'll now turn to Minister Uresco.